They told me I stole my own father's love, that 18 years in an army uniform was nothing but an excuse for a woman who couldn't cut it in the real world. They said I manipulated a dying man into signing away everything he owned. They put my name in the local paper next to words like predator and fraud. And the man who said all of it, the man who smiled for the cameras while he did it, was my own brother. What none of them knew, what nobody in that courtroom could have possibly known, was that the lawyer standing across from me had met me before, years earlier, in a place none of us ever talk about. My name is Paige Bailey. I'm 38 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and I had been home from deployment for exactly 6 days when the process server found me in the parking lot of a grocery store in Fayetteville, North Carolina, holding a bag of oranges I never got to eat. I remember the weight of the envelope more than the words on it. Legal paper has a particular heaviness, a stiffness that tells you before you even open it that your life is about to be rearranged by people who never once had to hold a rifle at 3 in the morning wondering if the sun would rise on you again. I set the oranges down on the hood of my car. I opened the envelope right there, standing in the heat, and I read my brother's name typed neatly at the top as the plaintiff. Ethan Bailey versus Paige Bailey. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so exactly like him that laughing was the only thing that kept me from screaming in a parking lot in front of strangers. Ethan is 46. He is my father's son from his first marriage, and I am the daughter from the second, the one who showed up when Ethan was already 8 years old, and set in his ways already certain that the world owed him something for the fact that his mother had died young. I was 13 when our father remarried. I was a stranger in that house from the very first night, and Ethan made sure I always knew it. He never hit me. He never needed to. He had a way of looking through me at the dinner table, of letting silence do the work that cruelty usually does, that taught me faster than any drill sergeant ever could how to make myself small, how to disappear into a room, how to survive without needing anyone's approval. Maybe that's why the army felt like coming up for air. The complaint, when I finally sat down and read it in full that night at my kitchen table with a glass of water going warm beside me, was almost impressive in its cruelty. It called me an uneducated military woman, as if 18 years of leadership deployments and a graduate degree earned between combat rotations amounted to nothing, because I'd done it in boots instead of a boardroom. It said I had exploited my father's declining mental state. It said I had isolated him from his only son. It said I had pressured a dying 74-year-old man into rewriting his will in my favor, cutting Ethan out of the farm, the house, the investment portfolio, the charitable trust our grandfather had started 60 years earlier. I read it twice. Then I folded it, set it on the table, and went to bed, because that is what 18 years of service teaches you. You don't fight the battle at midnight. You fight it when you're rested, when you're clear, when your hands aren't shaking. 2 days later, Ethan went on the local morning show. I watched the clip on my phone the next morning, coffee going cold in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen like it might somehow change what I already knew was coming. He sat there in a blue suit that fit too well for a man who was supposedly grieving, and he leaned toward the host with practiced sincerity in his eyes. "She spent her life in uniform," he said, "because she couldn't survive in the real world." The host nodded along. Nobody in that studio asked him a single hard question. Nobody asked why a man who had borrowed against our father's accounts 3 separate times, who had watched his real estate ventures collapse twice, who had never once flown home when our father was hospitalized with pneumonia 2 winters ago. Nobody asked why that man was the one wearing the expression of a betrayed son. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call a reporter. I didn't call Ethan. I let it sit. Let people believe whatever the segment told them to believe. Because I have learned something in combat zones that civilians rarely get the chance to learn. The loudest voice in the room is very often the most frightened one. And silence, real silence, unnerves people far more than any argument ever could. But silence has a cost too. I watched it in the eyes of my neighbors at the mailbox, in the way a woman at the pharmacy suddenly found something urgent to do with her purse when she recognized my face from the news. I let them think I was weak. I let them think I had no answer. I had spent my whole career being underestimated by men who mistook my calm for an absence of will, and if there was one thing the army had actually given me, it was patience, the kind that outlasts anyone in a room. The morning of the hearing, I put on my dress uniform. Not because my lawyer told me to, because I wanted to walk into that courtroom exactly as myself without apology, without softening a single ribbon on my chest for anyone's comfort. The courtroom smelled like old wood polish and nerves. I walked down the center aisle, my boots quiet against the floor, and I felt every eye in that gallery follow me. Ethan's attorney's chair was still empty when I sat down, and then the side door opened and a tall, gray-haired man in an expensive suit walked in carrying a leather folio thick with what I assumed was everything meant to destroy me. He looked up. Our eyes met across that room, and something happened to his face that I will never forget, the color draining out of it, the folio slipping slightly in his grip, his mouth opening around a question he clearly couldn't stop himself from asking, even here, even now, even with a judge 2 feet away and my brother watching from across the aisle. "It's really you." I didn't answer him. Not out loud. Not in that moment, standing there with the whole courtroom watching 2 strangers stare at each other like the floor had opened beneath them. I just held his gaze for 1 long second, then took my seat beside my own attorney, folded my hands the way I'd been trained to fold them at attention, and let the question hang in the air unanswered. Some things you don't explain in front of an audience. Some things you carry until the moment is right. But his face stayed with me. It pulled me backward the way a scent or a sound can drag you through years in an instant, and before the bailiff had even called the room to order, I was somewhere else entirely, 13 years old, standing in the doorway of a house that had just become half mine and half a stranger's. My father married Diane the summer I turned 13. I remember the wedding more as a collection of sensations than a single memory, the itch of a dress I didn't want to wear, the smell of gardenias wilting in the July heat. My father's hand steady on my shoulder, as if he understood even then that I needed an anchor. What I remember most clearly is Ethan, 18 years old, arms crossed at the back of the reception hall, watching the whole thing like a man watching his inheritance walk out the door in a white dress. He never said a cruel word to me in front of adults. He was smarter than that, even young. But when it was just the 2 of us in that house, he had a gift for silence that could strip the air out of a room. He'd look at me across the dinner table, and then look away like I wasn't worth the effort of contempt, only the effort of dismissal. I learned to eat fast. I learned to disappear before dessert. I learned without anyone teaching me directly that love in that house was something rationed, and I had shown up too late to get my share. I enlisted the week after I turned 18. My father cried at the bus station, which surprised me because I hadn't known until that moment that he'd noticed me leaving at all. Ethan didn't come. He stayed home, said something about a business meeting he couldn't miss, and I remember feeling even then a strange and unwelcome relief. It was easier to go without having to watch his face not care. The years that followed him were not kind to Ethan, though he would never have described them that way himself. He tried real estate first, a development outside Charlotte that collapsed before the foundations were even poured, and my father quietly wired $40,000 to cover the losses so the bank wouldn't come after the family name. Then came the restaurant venture 2 years later, and then the consulting firm that consisted, as far as I ever understood, of Ethan consulting mostly with other men's money. Each time my father paid. Each time Diane defended him with the particular fierceness of a mother who has decided her son's failures are simply misunderstood ambition. Each time nobody told me, because nobody ever told me anything about that house unless I asked directly, and by then I'd learned not to ask. I was overseas more often than not during those years, Georgia, then Germany, then deployments. I still can't fully discuss even now, years stitched together by static phone calls and letters that arrived weeks after they were written. But I sent money home. Not because anyone asked me to. Because somewhere in me, underneath the rank and the training, there was still a 13-year-old girl, trying to prove she belonged in that family, trying to earn a kind of love that shouldn't have needed earning at all. I never told my father not to mention it to Ethan. I never had to. My father did that on his own quietly, the way he did most things that mattered to him. I found out only years later from a bank statement he'd left in an old filing cabinet that he'd kept a separate ledger, money in from me, money out, to cover Ethan's losses, a careful accounting of a family he was trying to hold together with numbers, because words had stopped working. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing your father knew exactly who you were, and chose for years not to say it out loud, not because he didn't love me. Because loving me openly meant admitting to himself and to Diane and to the world That the son he'd raised from birth had become someone he could no longer fully trust, and the daughter he'd once nearly lost to a life in uniform had become the only one still standing beside him. I think that realization broke something loose in him eventually. In his last 2 years after Diane passed, and it was just the two of them, him and whatever version of Ethan kept circling back for help, I noticed a change in his letters. Less careful, less like a man protecting a peace that no longer existed. He started asking about my career in a way that felt less like small talk and more like inventory, like he was quietly weighing something, turning it over, deciding. I didn't know then what he was deciding. I found out the way the rest of the world found out, in a lawyer's office, in a room full of people who thought they already knew how the story would end. The reading of the will took place on a gray Tuesday in October, 11 days after we buried him. I remember the room more than I remember grieving properly that week, a conference room on the 4th floor of a law office downtown, the kind with a long table too polished to be comfortable, and a view of a parking garage instead of sky. Diane had passed 2 years earlier, so it was just Ethan, his wife Carol, my father's longtime accountant Mr. Hensley, and me sitting in a chair that felt too small for the weight of what was about to happen. The attorney reading the will was not yet Richard Whitmore. That name meant nothing to any of us that afternoon. This was an older man named Foster, my father's estate attorney for nearly 20 years, a man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and a voice that never once wavered as he worked through the document line by line. The farm went to me. 240 acres that had been in my father's family since before either Ethan or I existed, the house I'd barely lived in as a child, but somehow still thought of as home every time I closed my eyes on deployment. The primary residence in town. The investment portfolio, modest but not insignificant, built slowly over 4 decades of a man who never trusted the stock market further than he could see it. And control of the Bailey Family Trust, the small charitable fund my grandfather had started, which mostly gave scholarships to kids from our county who wanted to serve. To Ethan, my father left $40,000 and a letter sealed to be opened privately. I watched Ethan's face change the way ice changes when a crack starts somewhere you can't see, and spreads before you understand what's happening. His jaw tightened first, then his hand flat on the table curled slowly into something closer to a fist. Carol reached for his arm and he shook her off, not violently but with a kind of contempt that told me this conversation had already happened somewhere between the two of them, some version of it rehearsed for exactly this outcome. "That's not possible," he said. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. "Read it again." Mr. Foster read it again. Nothing changed. Ethan stood up so fast his chair scraped backward against the hardwood, a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in that small room. He looked at me, really looked at me maybe for the first time in years, and what I saw in his face wasn't grief. It was calculation, fast and cold, a man already 3 moves ahead in a game the rest of us didn't know we were playing. "She brainwashed him," he said, not to me, to the room, to Mr. Foster, to Carol, to anyone who might repeat it later. "She's been gone half his life, and now she walks in and takes everything. I was here every week." I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to someone who has already decided the story rarely changes the ending. It only gives them more material to twist. I sat with my hands folded on the table, the same posture I'd held through 4 combat deployments and 2 congressional briefings, and I let him finish. "I'm getting a lawyer," he said, jabbing a finger toward me like it was a weapon. "The best one in this city. We'll see how brainwashed a judge thinks he was." He was gone before I could respond. Carol trailing behind him, her heels sharp and quick against the floor, and Mr. Foster closed the folder in front of him with a soft, tired sigh, the sigh of a man who had seen exactly this scene play out in exactly this room more times than he probably cared to count. Ethan didn't waste time. Within a week, word came through Mr. Hensley that he'd retained Richard Whitmore, the most feared litigator in the state, a man with a reputation for turning sympathetic juries against even the most sympathetic defendants. I remember hearing the name for the first time and feeling nothing but a kind of tired resolve settle into my chest, the same feeling I used to get before a difficult mission briefing. Not fear exactly, just the recognition that something hard was coming and there was no version of the next few months that would be easy. What none of us knew, Not Ethan, not Carol, not even Richard Whitmore himself in that first week before he'd so much as glanced at my name attached to the case file, was that he was about to spend his evenings preparing to dismantle a woman he had spent years trying to find, a woman he owed a debt he had never been able to repay, because he'd never been able to locate her. He read through the complaint his own client had drafted. He read the accusations: manipulation, undue influence, exploitation of a vulnerable elderly man, and something in the language must have nagged at him, even then some instinct built over 30 years of trial work that told him the facts didn't sit quite right. But he had a client, he had a case, and he had not yet seen my face. That would come later in a courtroom on a morning neither of us would ever forget. Richard Whitmore had built his career on a simple, brutal talent: he could read a person before they finished their first sentence. 31 years in courtrooms across the state had given him an instinct for the moment a witness's story started to fray, the half-second hesitation before a lie, the particular stillness of someone telling the truth and knowing no one will believe them anyway. He prided himself on it. It was the thing that had made him rich, made him feared, made opposing counsel settle cases rather than face him in front of a jury. He walked into the preliminary hearing that morning with every intention of doing exactly what Ethan Bailey was paying him to do. He had the complaint memorized. He had a strategy mapped out in his head, established the age and vulnerability of the deceased, cast doubt on the timeline of the will's revision, suggest gently but persistently that a decorated soldier's absence from her father's daily life made her an unlikely candidate for his sudden, complete trust. It was not a case built on love. It was a case built on architecture. And Richard Whitmore built legal architecture better than almost anyone alive. Then the side door of the courtroom opened, and Paige Bailey walked in wearing her dress uniform, and the entire structure he'd spent 2 weeks constructing in his mind simply stopped existing. He would tell me later that his first thought wasn't recognition. It was a kind of vertigo, the sense of a name and a face refusing to align with the 18 years that had passed between them. But then she turned her head just slightly, the way she must have turned it 1,000 times, giving orders in places he could only imagine, and the vertigo resolved into certainty so total it nearly buckled his knees. He was back in a compound outside a city whose name still to this day made his chest tighten. He was a JAG officer, then a legal advisor attached to a unit doing work he wasn't cleared to fully understand, sent overseas not to fight, but to make sure the people who did fight stayed within the lines the law demanded, even in places where the lines themselves felt like a cruel joke. His daughter Emily, 24 years old and idealistic in the specific way only 24-year-olds can afford to be, was there too, working with an aid organization distributing supplies to a refugee settlement 3 miles from where he was stationed. He hadn't wanted her there. He'd said so more than once in arguments that ended with her reminding him that his job was to advise soldiers not to parent a grown woman. The attack came on an ordinary Tuesday, which is somehow the detail that had stayed with him most clearly over the years. Not the violence of it, but the mundanity of the morning before coffee and paperwork, and Emily texting him a photo of a child she'd been playing with the day before. The reports that came in afterward were fragmented, the kind of chaos that makes clean narrative impossible to construct even years later. What he knew for certain was this gunfire, a convoy caught in the open, casualties on both sides, and somewhere in the middle of it, a young army captain who had no operational reason to be anywhere near that convoy, running back through open ground twice to pull civilians to cover. One of those civilians was his daughter. He didn't learn the captain's name that day. Military reports in the immediate aftermath of an incident like that are careful, deliberately thin on identifying details, and by the time he thought to track down the soldier who had run through gunfire for a stranger's daughter, she had already rotated out, already vanished into the vast anonymous machinery of the army, the way soldiers who don't want to be found always seem to manage. He tried. For almost 2 years after returning stateside, he tried letters to units, calls to public affairs officers, a request through a colleague still in uniform who owed him a favor. Every trail went cold. Eventually, he told himself it was because she didn't want to be found, and he made himself respect that, even though respecting it felt like swallowing glass every single year on the anniversary of the attack, when Emily called him just to say she was alive and well and raising 2 kids of her own now in Ohio. He never told Ethan any of this, of course. There was no reason to. It had never occurred to him that the two threads of his life, his gratitude for a stranger, his obligation to a paying client, might ever cross paths in a courtroom on an unremarkable Tuesday morning. But there she was. He would describe it to me later as the strangest 30 seconds of his professional life, standing in front of a judge, opposing counsel, and his own client holding a folio full of arguments designed to paint a war hero as a manipulative opportunist, while the war hero in question sat 20 feet away, and he understood with total and immediate clarity that he had absolutely no idea what he was actually looking at. He did not withdraw that day. He wanted to be honest about that when he told me the story. Later, he didn't drop everything in some cinematic gesture the moment recognition hit him. He was a professional, and professionals do not abandon clients on instinct alone, however powerful that instinct might be. He sat through the hearing. He said what he'd prepared to say. But that night, alone in his office, long after his staff had gone home, he pulled the case file back out and began reading it again this time, not as an advocate building a case, but as a man looking very carefully for the truth he suddenly needed to know. He started with the emails. Ethan had submitted a packet of correspondence as evidence messages supposedly showing William Bailey, confused, agitated, worried about Paige controlling everything, dated across the final 8 months of his life. Richard had glanced at them before satisfied that they supported his client's narrative. Now reading them slowly with the particular attention of a man who no longer trusted the person who'd handed them to him, he noticed something that turned his stomach. The formatting was wrong, obviously not in a way a judge skimming the packet would catch, but wrong in the way a forger's slight overconfidence always shows itself to someone who knows exactly what to look for. Email headers carry more information than most people realize, timestamps, server routing metadata that survives even when the visible text has been altered. Richard had a technical consultant he trusted, a woman named Priya, who'd helped him win 3 cases involving digital evidence, and he sent her the files that same night with a 2-line message that gave nothing away. Her answer came back before 9 the next morning. 4 of the 6 emails had been edited after their original send dates. 2 showed signs of having been assembled from fragments of real messages, stitched together, phrases moved out of context to build sentences William Bailey had never actually written in that order. Richard sat with that for a long time before he called Ethan. He didn't say what he'd found, not yet. He asked instead where the emails had come from, who had access to William's old computer after his death, whether anyone else had helped prepare the documentation for the case. Ethan's answers came too fast, too smooth, the answers of a man who had rehearsed them long before anyone asked. Richard had cross-examined enough liars in 31 years to know the difference between a man remembering and a man performing memory, and Ethan was performing. The recordings troubled him even more. Ethan had submitted an audio clip 4 minutes long, purportedly a phone call between William and a hospice social worker, in which William could be heard saying in a slurred and confused voice that he didn't know what Paige was making him sign. Priya's analysis came back within 2 days. The audio had been compiled from at least 3 separate recordings, spliced at points, designed to be nearly undetectable to the ear, William's actual words about an entirely different, unrelated matter reassembled into a sentence he had never spoken. Then came the witness. A woman named Deborah Sykes, listed as a former home health aide, who claimed to have witnessed Paige pressuring William during a visit in his final year. Richard called the placement agency listed on her employment records. They had no file on her. He called the number Ethan had provided for her. It rang twice and disconnected. When he finally reached her through a different channel 3 days later, she admitted haltingly that Carol had approached her at a diner and offered $8,000 for testimony, coaching her through exactly what to say on the stand. The final piece was the ugliest. Buried in a box of financial records Richard's paralegal had pulled for background, there were loan documents, 3 separate loans William had made to Ethan over the past 9 years, each one carefully notarized, each one never repaid, totaling just under $200,000. Ethan had told Richard in their very first meeting that he'd never asked their father for a dime. Richard had believed him. Now he understood that everything Ethan had told him from the beginning had been constructed with the same care as the doctored emails, plausible, polished, and entirely false. He called Ethan into his office on a Thursday evening, the 2 of them alone, the city going dark outside the window behind Richard's desk. He laid the documents out one at a time, not raising his voice, not performing outrage, just placing evidence on the table the way he'd placed evidence in front of 1,000 witnesses over the course of his career. "The emails were altered," he said. "The recording was spliced. Your witness was paid to lie under oath, and you owe your father $200,000 you never disclosed to me." He looked up. "If this is true, and I have every reason to believe it is, we're done. I won't build a case on fraud." Ethan didn't deny it, not directly. That was the detail that stayed with Richard longest. He told me that Ethan never once said it isn't true. He said other things instead. He said Paige didn't deserve the farm. He said their father had never understood what it cost him to stay to be the son who showed up in person, while Paige hid behind a uniform on the other side of the world. He said the ends mattered more than the means, that fairness sometimes required a little help to arrive where it was supposed to. Richard listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Richard closed the folder in front of him and said very quietly that he would be filing a motion to withdraw as counsel within the week, and that Ethan would be wise to find new representation immediately, because whatever happened next, Richard Whitmore would not be the one standing beside him when it did. Ethan left his office that night, still convinced Richard said that he had done nothing wrong. That conviction would not survive very much longer. The motion to withdraw hit the docket on a Monday morning, and by the time the courtroom reconvened 2 weeks later, the story had already started leaking through the county the way these things always do in a place small enough for everyone to know somebody who knows somebody. I heard it first from Mr. Hensley, who called me sounding almost giddy, a tone I'd never once heard from a man whose entire professional demeanor consisted of careful, measured neutrality. "He dropped him," Hensley said. "Whitmore dropped Ethan as a client. Right there in open court." I didn't feel triumph when I heard it. I felt something quieter, more like the release of a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since that morning in the parking lot with the oranges. I'd spent weeks preparing myself for a long, ugly fight, the kind where truth moves slower than accusation, and reputations get shredded long before verdicts arrive. I hadn't let myself imagine an ending that came this fast or this clean. When the courtroom filled again, Ethan sat alone at the defense table except for a new attorney, a younger man clearly overwhelmed by a case file he'd inherited only days earlier, flipping through documents with the frantic energy of someone trying to build a raft in the middle of a flood. Richard sat in the gallery now, not at counsel's table, present only as a witness the court had subpoenaed once the fraud allegations came to light. I caught his eye once briefly before the judge called the room to order, and he gave me the smallest nod, the kind of gesture that says more than any speech could. The witnesses came one after another that day, and each one chipped away another piece of the story Ethan had spent months constructing. My father's physician testified first, walking the court through 18 months of medical records that showed no diagnosis of cognitive decline, no medication that would have impaired judgment, nothing but a 74-year-old man managing arthritis and mild hypertension with the same sharp, stubborn clarity he'd had his whole life. The accountant who'd helped my father restructure his portfolio 2 years before his death testified that William had asked detailed, informed questions in every single meeting, had pushed back on recommendations he disagreed with, had been, in the accountant's words, one of the most engaged clients I've worked with in 20 years. Then came Mr. Foster, the original estate attorney, who described the day my father had come into his office alone, without me, without anyone, and asked to revise his will. Foster testified that he'd met with William on 4 separate occasions over 6 weeks, that he'd required, as he always did with elderly clients, an independent capacity evaluation before finalizing any changes, and that the evaluation had come back unambiguous. My father knew exactly what he was doing. He had explained his reasoning to Foster in detail, not with anger toward Ethan, Foster testified, but with a kind of tired sorrow. The sorrow of a man who had spent years covering for a son who never once said thank you. The bank records came next, entered without objection since Ethan's new attorney had no grounds left to contest them. 3 loans, $200,000, every payment schedule broken, every promise unkept. And then, in what I understood later was the moment that broke whatever composure Ethan had left, the court played the security footage from my father's home office, recovered from a camera system Ethan himself hadn't known still existed, installed years earlier, after a break-in scare, and largely forgotten since. It showed a date 11 months before my father's death. It showed Ethan sitting across the desk from him, leaning forward, his voice audible, even through the tinny built-in microphone, saying words that needed no interpretation from any attorney in that room. "You have to fix this before it's too late, Dad. Before she talks you into something you'll regret." My father's response, quiet but clear, cut through the courtroom like something physical. "The only person talking me into anything, son, is you, right now, in this room." I watched Ethan's face while that recording played. I watched Carol's hand find his arm again, and this time he didn't shake her off. I watched something in him finally visibly collapse, not into remorse, not yet, but into the particular exhaustion of a man who has run out of new lies to tell. The judge didn't take long to rule. The will stood unaltered and unchallenged. The court found in language I still remember almost word for word that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated William Bailey's full mental competence and clear, deliberate intent, and that the plaintiff had, through his own conduct and that of his agents, attempted to defraud the court through fabricated evidence and suborned testimony. The judge referred the matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation. Ethan didn't look at me as the ruling was read. He stared straight ahead at some point on the wall behind the judge's bench, his jaw tight, his hands flat on the table in front of him, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something other than distance when I looked at him. I felt sorry for him. Not enough to change anything, but enough to understand that he had spent his whole life chasing a version of our father's love that had never actually been withheld from him, only offered differently than he'd wanted it, and he had burned down everything trying to force it into a shape it was never going to take. The courthouse steps were still damp from an early rain when I walked out that afternoon, and Richard was waiting for me at the bottom, hands in his coat pockets, looking older somehow than he had in the courtroom, as if the weight he'd been carrying for years had finally settled into his shoulders now that he could set it down. "I've waited a long time to say this properly," he said. His voice wasn't the courtroom voice any, more measured and sharp. It was quieter, rougher around the edges. "I've waited years to thank you." I told him he didn't owe me anything. I meant it. What I did that day overseas wasn't a transaction, wasn't something I'd ever expected to be repaid for, and standing there on those wet steps, I found myself almost embarrassed by the intensity of his gratitude, the way you get embarrassed when someone insists on thanking you for something that felt in the moment like the only decent thing a person could do. But he shook his head and he told me about Emily. 31 now, married, 2 kids, living outside Columbus, working as a pediatric nurse. A career she'd told him more than once she chose because of what happened that day, because survival had taught her something about fragility and second chances that she wanted to spend her life honoring. He showed me a photo on his phone, a little girl with Emily's same stubborn chin, and something in my chest loosened in a way I hadn't expected, a knot I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying since I walked away from that convoy years ago without ever learning what became of the woman I'd pulled to safety. "If you hadn't gone back," he said, and then he stopped because some sentences don't need finishing and we both knew it. We didn't stay long on those steps. There wasn't much more to say that wouldn't have cheapened what had already been said, and Richard, for all his courtroom eloquence, seemed to understand that better than most people would have. He shook my hand, told me to call if I ever needed anything, and walked off toward a car waiting at the curb, a man carrying something lighter than he'd carried in years. Ethan was charged 3 weeks later. Fraud, evidence, tampering, subornation of perjury. The district attorney's office moved faster than I expected, faster than Ethan's new attorney seemed prepared for. I didn't take pleasure in it the way I thought I might. I'd spent so many months bracing for a fight that when the fight finally ended, what I felt wasn't victory so much as a kind of stillness, the quiet that comes after a long deployment when your body finally understands it's allowed to rest. I went back to the farm the following weekend alone for the first time since the funeral. The house was exactly as my father had left it, his reading glasses still on the side table, a coffee mug still in the drying rack, the particular silence of a home that hasn't yet learned how to be empty. I walked through each room, slowly touching things I hadn't touched since I was a girl, and in the study tucked into the drawer of his desk, exactly where Mr. Foster had told me it would be, I found the letter. It wasn't long. My father was never a man of many words, not on paper and not out loud, and the letter read more like something spoken quietly across a kitchen table than something composed for posterity. Paige, I know what they'll say about the will. I know what your brother will say, and I know some of it will hurt because that's what family does even when it doesn't mean to. I want you to know I thought about this for a long time, longer than anyone realizes. I watched you carry more than you ever let on for longer than you should have had to, and I never found the right way to tell you that I saw it. This is the only way I knew how. People will remember what I left you. I hope one day they'll understand why. Love, always, Dad. I sat with that letter for a long time in the fading afternoon light, the farm quiet around me, the way it's quiet only in places that have belonged to the same family for generations, where the silence itself seems to carry the shape of everyone who ever lived there. I thought about the 13-year-old girl who'd stood in a doorway feeling like a stranger in her own home. I thought about every deployment, every letter sent and unanswered, every dollar wired home without explanation, because explanation had never been the point. I thought about a man I'd pulled through gunfire on the other side of the world, and the daughter he raised, and the strange, unlikely thread that had connected all of it back to this farmhouse, this desk, this letter. I don't know if Ethan will ever understand what our father was trying to tell him in his own letter, the one sealed and private, the one I've never asked to read and never will. Some things aren't mine to know, but I know what I understand now, sitting in that study with the last light coming through the window the way it used to when I was young enough to still believe every room in that house belonged to me. I understand that inheritance was never really about the farm or the money or the trust. It was about being seen. My father saw me finally completely, even if it took him most of a lifetime to find the words for it. And whatever else this year cost me, the headlines, the accusations, the brother I may never fully get back, I walked out of that house for the first time, in longer than I could remember, feeling exactly what my father must have felt. Every single day he sat at that desk, quietly, making sure I knew in the only language he had left that I was loved. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below, because stories like this one deserve to travel as far as the people who feel them. We share stories like Paige's every single day, hear stories about families torn apart and sometimes quietly put back together, and if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and hit subscribe now. Let's keep walking through these stories together, one family, one truth at a time.